This just in, the judge overseeing former President Trump's fraud trial in New York issued an order barring Trump or any other defendants in the sweeping case from transferring any assets or creating a new entity to acquire them without disclosure first. The order, which came via the case's online docket, was delivered on the fourth day of the trial. Meanwhile, former President Trump railed against the fraud trial attorney General Letitia James brought against him. Among his many attacks, Trump has argued he's not getting a fair process because he's not going before a jury. Let's watch.
This trial is a total witch hunt, and I should be entitled to a jury like everybody else is entitled to a jury. I have no rights to have a jury. It's ridiculous.
Now, per several reports, his legal team failed to check a box requesting a trial by jury in their initial court filings, a suggestion one of his lawyers, Alina Habba, has denied.
Meanwhile, Attorney General Letitia James beat back the slew of attacks the former president lobbed at her. Take a look.
Mr. Trump's comments were offensive, they were baseless, they were void of any facts and or any evidence. What they were comments that unfortunately fomented violence, comments that I would describe as race baiting. I will not be bullied. And so Mr. Trump is no longer here. The Donald Trump show is over. This was nothing more than a political stunt, a fundraising stop.
For background on what Donald Trump said, he called the judge rogue and he called Ms. James a terrible person, going on to suggest that the two were criminals, I think, among other things. What do you make of this?
Did this come down to not checking a box? Because if those reports are true, that is yet another piece of proof that we are living through a Veep live action documentary and none of this is actually truly real, because again, it's a mix of like blah, blah, blah law firm from Arrested Development and Veep, because it's like, how is this happening? You're on the legal team defending the front runner in the Republican presidential primary. You are representing a former president. You are representing the head of the Trump organization and the person who, had The Apprentice, Celebrity Apprentice, all this stuff, Trump golf courses, and you forgot to check a box, potentially.
Well, look, Trump has now had a history of struggling to get good representation. At one point, he was using Rudy Giuliani. I think there are many attorneys who are not interested in taking these kinds of cases. I'm sure there's many who are. Obviously, it's very high profile, and there's a lot of money and fame, notoriety at stake. But even good lawyers sometimes make these kind of errors. And if there's a team where there's a lot of communication and there's a lot of pomp and bluster, and maybe there's not a lot of good communication happening with the principal here, I can see how something like this, a mistake like this might have been made. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe a judgment was made about whether or not this should be a jury trial. Because remember, Trump has also complained about not getting a fair jury because of the nature of the media, and this is in New York. Yep. So there are Trump supporters in New York. New York is not as blue as people would like to think it is. There's still like a 40% Republican base in places like Staten Island and the like. But I could see Trump's legal team saying, we don't want a jury. We're purposefully not ticking the jury box. And then Trump later on saying, well, I don't like this. I want to be able to make my case. I'm the greatest showman. Yeah. And getting mad about it after the fact. So again, his team disputes that they failed to tick the box. I'm sure it'll come out one way or the other soon. But, this kind of confusion and infighting does seem to be endemic to a lot of spaces that Donald Trump is in. Yeah, and it's interesting to see as this case has moved forward. A lot of his quotes, he was talking about her being a terrible person, whatever, reminds me so much of sort of the early days of the 2016 presidential primary, where he was going out with all these things, and you had this big sort of reckoning over whether Donald Trump should be taken seriously or literally. And it's interesting to see that that's sort of where he's shining now, is up against all these court battles instead of on a debate stage, for example, in this primary, much to the chagrin of the networks that are carrying those debates and his fellow Republicans who would love the chance to go after him. And it's been fun to watch. I don't know if fun's the right word, but it's entertaining to watch how, instead of in a presidential campaign cycle attacking
his fellow primary opponents or Joe Biden as much. He's mostly just playing it out in the courtrooms or outside the courtrooms after these cases happen. And it's very interesting to see how that changes. Obviously, his poll numbers, if those are to be trusted, and he seems to be trusting them because he's constantly emailing them out about how far in the lead he is.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see if that lasts or if he's eventually going to have to pivot and do less of the courtroom-related talking and more of the primary talking or the general talking.
Yeah, as a pundit myself and someone who has populist political sympathies, it is frustrating to me that what you described means we're not hearing about the issues that are most important to the American people. From a strategic perspective, I wonder what Letitia James and her cohort are thinking, because I don't think it's helpful to anybody who wants Trump to not win to speak in a way that does make his claims that he's being politically targeted feel validated. It is true that Letitia James ran on prosecuting Trump. It is true that when you hear her talk, there seems to be some real animus. And I'm not saying that's undeserved animus. If someone was telling me I'm a very terrible person for doing my job, I might feel the same way. But they've got themselves entangled in this who said the bad thing first, who's prosecuting who's attacking who cycle, that I think inures to the benefit of Donald Trump. To the extent that people might be frustrated that he's not talking about policy or kitchen table issues and instead defending himself all the time, well, I think they get sucked right back in if they feel like he's being unfairly targeted. The left has been largely kind of not as enthusiastic about, say, Marianne Williamson's campaign, at least as compared to Bernie Sanders. But there have been a couple of moments where she's gotten some slights from the mainstream media. And I've noticed online there's a very quick support wave that comes along with that, because my enemy's enemy is my friend. And I think that's what they're doing with Donald Trump here. So strategically, I'm not sure what that's about. I wonder what you make of some of the underlying fraud claim here. I've had some discussions with other co-hosts over the course of the last week or so about whether or not they're meritorious. Obviously, there was a pretrial judgment that the fraud happened, that he overstated the square footage of his properties and overvalued Mar-a-Lago by a factor of, I think, 2,300.
Something like that, yeah.
But there's still some discussion going on about whether or not that was a fair pretrial assessment, and whether or not any of that matters if there aren't any underlying claims that he cheated anybody or failed to pay any debts or things like that.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting to hear sort of just within the right how there are different discussions going on about this, because again, this is all playing out also in the middle of this Republican presidential primary. You have people who are sort of on the DeSantis, Haley, Scott side of things saying, this is just emblematic of why he, exaggerates too much and doesn't take things seriously, including taxes and et cetera, and that's why he's found himself in 4 sort of simultaneous indictments. Then on the Trump side, you have, again, this claim that this is all part of this witch hunt out to get him. First it was the Russia hoax, then it was the impeachments and his perfect phone call. Now it's these 4 trials. And, just this idea that, it's absurd that this is how much Mar-a-Lago is worth. And I do think, to that point, there is some subjectivity in evaluations of what things are worth. Depending on who you have look at your house and appraise it, you could get a different dollar amount. I'm not sure if the dollar amounts would differ by thousands of percents.
Thousands of percents.
But that is something that, again, they've said, they use kind of the subjectivity of this to make it look like he's exaggerating how much his properties are worth. And I've also heard some people say that basically the number that was put forward is not the actual value of Mar-a-Lago, it was just an evaluation of certain parts of the value in the eyes of the law or tax code and things like that. I think, to your point you were just making, Donald Trump being under attack is very good for Donald Trump. And he himself has joked about how, I wish I could be indicted a 5th time, keep him coming at this point, because every single time he was indicted and then had to go turn himself in, and especially when he got the mugshot, you just see him surge in support, and it is that underdog effect that you again see with Williamson's campaign, RFK Jr. to an extent, when he testified on Capitol Hill and they were trying to shut down him even answering, how have you been censored? They wouldn't even let him say how they've already censored him, and so that does cause that huge swell of support. But I think at a certain point, it's going to be hard to see him taking the platform he has by constantly having every news outlet in the world asking him what's going on when he walks out of these courtrooms and not using it to message about what's going on in America, what positions him to be the best candidate against both his fellow Republicans for now and ultimately against Joe Biden. Obviously, with the polling the way it is, I don't think he sees a need to make his case politically right now. But I think eventually it would be good for him to start hitting Joe Biden when, again, he has every single person watching him.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, stick with us. More Rising for you right after this.